An empath does not vanish because they are weak. They disappear because they have been strong for far too long. They are the ones who stayed when it was uncomfortable, who listened when no one else wanted to hear, who felt the emotional undercurrents in every room and tried to make them gentler for everyone else. They gave without keeping score. They explained themselves again and again, hoping understanding would eventually land. They believed that love meant endurance, that compassion meant self-erasure, that patience could heal what accountability refused to touch. But here is what makes an empath leave: chronic dismissal, emotional neglect, being told they are too sensitive instead of being met with curiosity, being gaslit into doubting their own perceptions when their nervous system is simply responding to truth, being expected to carry emotional labor while their own needs are minimized, postponed, or ignored. An empath can survive pain, but they cannot survive being unseen. When an empath is repeatedly placed in environments where their boundaries are violated, something profound begins to happen inside them. At first, they try harder. They communicate more gently. They lower their expectations. They rationalize behavior that hurts them because they understand where it comes from. They carry other people's unhealed wounds as if they were their responsibility. But understanding without reciprocity becomes self-betrayal, and there comes a moment, quiet, internal, irreversible, when the empath realizes that staying is costing them their sense of self, that their body is tired before their mind admits it, that the anxiety, the exhaustion, the numbness are not personal flaws but intelligent signals. Signals saying this is not safe anymore, this is not mutual, this is not love. So they stop explaining, not because they have nothing to say, but because they finally understand that the person in front of them is not listening. They stop chasing closure from people who benefit from confusion. They stop pouring energy into relationships that only exist because of their effort. And when they leave, it can look sudden to those who were never paying attention. The disappearance of an empath is not dramatic. It is grounded. It is regulated. It is calm. That is what makes it so unsettling. There is no argument to win, no final plea, no emotional explosion, just distance, just silence, just a boundary that no longer negotiates with guilt. And here is the part many misunderstand. When an empath leaves, they do not leave with hatred. They leave with clarity. They may still wish you well. They may still understand your pain, but they will no longer sacrifice themselves to soothe it. They have learned, often the hard way, that empathy without self-protection becomes self-harm. If you want to know how to make an empath disappear from your life, the formula is simple. Keep taking without giving. Keep dismissing their feelings. Keep taking without giving. Keep dismissing their feelings. Keep crossing boundaries and calling it love. Keep demanding loyalty while refusing accountability. Keep mistaking their silence for weakness. Eventually, they will choose themselves, and you will feel the absence of the very person who made everything easier, warmer, more human. But this message is not only for those who have lost an empath, it is also for the empaths listening right now. If this resonates in your body, if you recognize yourself in these words, know this: you are not too much. You are not broken. You are simply giving in places where you are not being met. Your sensitivity is not a liability. It is a finely tuned instrument, and it deserves environments that honor it, not exploit it. So here is your call to action. Stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable. Start listening to your body when it says no. Choose relationships where empathy flows both ways. Set boundaries even when your voice shakes. Walk away without needing permission. Protect your energy as if your life depends on it, because in many ways it does. Choose yourself, not out of bitterness, but out of truth. And when you do, watch how your presence becomes sacred again, because you are no longer available to be taken for granted. An empath begins to disappear long before they physically leave, and the first fracture always happens in moments of repeated emotional dismissal. Not the loud kind, not always cruelty, but the quiet, corrosive experience of not being taken seriously when something inside them is signaling distress. An empath notices tone before words, absence before explanation, tension before conflict. When they express discomfort, they are not asking for perfection, they are asking for presence. Yet what they often receive instead is minimization. You're overthinking. It's not that deep. You're too sensitive. Each of these statements teaches the empath a dangerous lesson, that their inner experience is inconvenient, exaggerated, or wrong. At first, the empath responds by doubting themselves. They replay conversations in their mind, searching for where they might have misunderstood. They intellectualize pain, trying to translate feeling into logic so it will be more acceptable to others. They tell themselves that empathy means flexibility, that love means patience, that if they just explain more clearly, more gently, more compassionately, understanding will eventually arrive. This is not weakness, it is conditioning. Many empaths learned early in life that harmony was maintained by reading the room, anticipating needs, and suppressing their own discomfort to keep connection intact. But emotional dismissal does not simply hurt feelings, it dysregulates the nervous system. When an empath's reality is repeatedly questioned, their body remains on alert. There is a constant scanning for danger, a subtle tightening in the chest, a fatigue that no amount of rest seems to cure. They may appear calm on the surface, but internally they are working overtime to maintain emotional equilibrium. Over time, this becomes exhaustion, not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from living in environments where authenticity feels unsafe. What makes this especially painful is that empaths are often deeply aware of why others behave the way they do. They understand trauma responses, defense mechanisms, emotional immaturity. They see the wounded child beneath the adult behavior. This awareness, while compassionate, becomes a trap when it is not balanced with self-protection. Understanding someone's pain does not require tolerating harm, but empaths are often taught that it does. So they stay, they endure, they absorb, they translate mistreatment into empathy, hoping love will heal what accountability has not touched. Yet every time their feelings are dismissed, something essential erodes. Trust. Not just trust in the other person, but trust in themselves. They begin to question their intuition, the very compass that guides their empathy. They silence themselves to avoid conflict. They choose peace over truth, not realizing that peace built on self-erasure is not peace at all. It is survival. An empath can tolerate misunderstanding for a long time, but what they cannot tolerate indefinitely is emotional loneliness within connection. Being physically present with someone who does not emotionally attune is more painful than being alone. The body knows this before the mind does. It shows up as anxiety, irritability, numbness, or a persistent sense of heaviness. These are not signs of weakness. They are signals that the environment is asking the empath to betray themselves in order to belong. As dismissal continues,
the empath starts to pull inward. They share less, not because they have less to say, but because they have learned it is unsafe to speak. They stop bringing up concerns because past attempts led to defensiveness, denial, or reversal of blame. They become quieter, more distant, more self-contained. To an outsider, this can look like withdrawal without explanation. In reality, it is the nervous system protecting itself after repeated injury. This is often the stage where others say,
You've changed. What they really mean is, you're no longer providing the emotional labor I benefited from. The empath is no longer smoothing tensions, no longer making excuses, no longer carrying the relational weight alone. They are conserving energy, sometimes without consciously deciding to. The body leads the way when the mind has been trained to endure too much. There is a deep grief in this phase. The empath mourns not only the relationship as it is, but the potential they once believed in. They grieve the version of themselves who tried harder, loved deeper, waited longer. They may feel guilt for pulling away, because empathy does not vanish simply because boundaries appear. They still care, they still understand, but care without reciprocity becomes a wound that never closes. Eventually a shift occurs. It is subtle, almost invisible. The empath stops asking to be seen and starts seeing themselves. They recognize that dismissal is not a communication problem. It is a relational pattern. They understand that explaining their pain to someone committed to misunderstanding it is a losing battle. This realization is not fueled by anger, but by clarity. A calm, grounded knowing that their energy is finite and their well-being is not negotiable. This is when the disappearance truly begins. Not with drama, not with ultimatums, but with an internal boundary that no longer bends. The empath is no longer willing to translate their humanity into something more palatable. They stop shrinking to fit spaces that cannot hold them. They begin choosing environments where their sensitivity is respected rather than tolerated, where their emotions are met with curiosity instead of dismissal, where connection does not require self-abandonment, and where their presence is valued not for what they provide, but for who they are in their full, unfiltered truth. Another powerful reason an empath disappears is the repeated violation of boundaries disguised as closeness, obligation, or love. Empaths often enter relationships with an open heart and an open nervous system. They feel deeply, intuitively, and relationally. Because of this, they may not lead with rigid boundaries. Instead, they lead with trust. They assume mutual care. They expect that if something feels uncomfortable, it will be noticed, respected, and adjusted. But when boundaries are crossed, again and again, especially after they have been clearly communicated, something inside the empath begins to shut down. At first, the empath tries to set gentle boundaries. They phrase their needs carefully, cushioning them with empathy so others won't feel attacked. They say things like, I understand why you feel this way, but I need, or I don't want to hurt you, but this is hard for me. Their boundaries are often tentative, apologetic, and soft. because they are trying to preserve connection while protecting themselves. But when these boundaries are ignored, negotiated, or punished, the empath learns that asserting needs comes at a cost. Each boundary violation sends a message to the empath's nervous system that their limits are not safe. It teaches them that closeness means intrusion, that love means access without consent, that their internal signals will be overridden by someone else's desires. Over time, this creates chronic stress. The empath becomes hypervigilant, constantly anticipating the next overstep. They may say yes when they mean no, simply to avoid conflict, guilt, or withdrawal of affection. This is not because they lack strength, but because their system has learned that resistance threatens attachment. What makes this particularly damaging is that boundary violations are often subtle. They are framed as jokes, concern, urgency, or emotional neediness. I just miss you. If you loved me, you would understand. You're the only one I can talk to. These statements place emotional responsibility on the empath, making it feel cruel or selfish to hold a line. The empath, attuned to others' pain, absorbs this weight and carries it, often without realizing how heavy it has become. As this pattern continues, the empath's inner world becomes crowded. There is less space for their own thoughts, feelings, and desires. They feel responsible for regulating other people's emotions, solving their problems, soothing their distress. Meanwhile, their own needs are postponed indefinitely. This imbalance creates resentment, but empaths are often uncomfortable with resentment. They see it as a moral failure rather than a signal. So instead of expressing it, they turn it inward. They blame themselves for feeling tired, irritable, or disconnected. Eventually, the body intervenes. Empaths may experience burnout, anxiety, or a sense of numbness that frightens them. They may wonder why they no longer feel joy in relationships that once mattered so much. The truth is not that they have stopped caring. It is that their system has reached its limit. Boundaries are not walls meant to keep others out. They are structures that allow connection to be sustainable. When boundaries are repeatedly violated, connection becomes a threat. At this stage, the empath may try one last time to assert themselves more clearly. Their voice may be steadier now, less apologetic. They say no without over-explaining. They ask for space without justifying it. And this is often when resistance intensifies. Others may accuse them of changing, becoming cold, or selfish. The empath is confronted with a painful realization. The version of them that was loved was the one without limits. This realization cuts deep. It forces the empath to see that what was called closeness was often access without accountability, that what was framed as love depended on their availability, their flexibility, their silence. When they stop providing unlimited emotional access, the relationship destabilizes, not because the empath is doing something wrong, but because the dynamic was never balanced to begin with. As boundaries continue to be challenged, the empath begins to detach emotionally. This detachment is not punishment, it is protection. They stop sharing personal information that can be used against them. They limit contact. They become less reactive, less accessible to others. This can feel like abandonment. To the empath, it feels like oxygen. This is where disappearance becomes inevitable. Not dramatic withdrawal, but a gradual reclaiming of space. The empath realizes that distance is sometimes the only boundary that will be respected. They learn that explaining boundaries to someone who benefits from crossing them is futile. So they stop explaining. They stop negotiating their needs. They choose themselves quietly, firmly, without needing to be understood. What many fail to recognize is that an empath does not disappear because they lack love. They disappear because they finally understand that love without boundaries is not love. It is self-erasure. They recognize that protecting their energy is not betrayal, but responsibility. Responsibility to their body, their mental health, their sense of self. They begin to seek relationships where boundaries are welcomed, not resisted, where no is honored without punishment, where space does not threaten connection, but strengthens it. In this phase, the empath may feel grief and relief at the same time. Grief for what could have been, relief for what no longer has to be endured. They start to feel their own presence again, their own desires, their own rhythm. The constant pressure lifts, the nervous system begins to settle, and with that settling comes clarity. The clarity that staying where boundaries are repeatedly violated is not loyalty, it is self-abandonment. The clarity that distance is sometimes the most compassionate choice for everyone involved. A final and decisive reason an empath disappears is the moment they realize that their compassion has been mistaken for permission to be harmed. This realization does not arrive suddenly. It emerges slowly, through patterns repeated often enough that they can no longer be explained away. The empath begins to see that their willingness to understand has been used to excuse behavior that never changes, that their patience has become a buffer, protecting others from the consequence of their actions, that their forgiveness has been treated not as a gift, but as an expectation. Empaths are often deeply introspective. When something goes wrong, their first instinct is to look inward. They ask themselves what they could have done differently, how they might have communicated better, whether they are being unfair. This self-reflection can be healthy, but in imbalanced relationships, it becomes a trap. The empath takes on disproportionate responsibility for relational breakdowns, while others take none. Over time, this creates a distorted reality, where the empath is always adjusting, and the other person is always staying the same. What shifts everything is when the empath notices that apologies are empty, accountability is temporary, and change is performative. Words may sound sincere, emotions may be expressed dramatically, but behavior remains untouched. Promises are made in moments of crisis, and forgotten in moments of comfort. The empath starts to see that remorse, without repair, is manipulation, whether intentional or not. That empathy offered to someone who refuses to grow becomes a resource they continue to drain. This recognition is painful because empaths do not give lightly. When they invest emotionally, they do so with hope. Not naive hope, but a belief in human capacity for healing and transformation. Letting go of that belief in a specific relationship feels like a loss of identity. It feels like admitting defeat. But eventually, the cost of holding on exceeds the pain of letting go. At this stage, the empath becomes acutely aware of imbalance. They notice how often they are the one initiating repair, softening conversations, regulating emotions in the room. They recognize that their presence stabilizes situations that would otherwise fall apart. And in that awareness comes another realization. If their absence would cause chaos, then their presence has been compensating for dysfunction. They have been holding together something that is not healthy on its own. This is where self-respect begins to awaken. Not as arrogance, not as superiority, but as a quiet boundary rooted in truth. The empath understands that love does not require them to remain in environments that repeatedly wound them. That compassion does not mean tolerating harm. That empathy without discernment becomes self-sacrifice disguised as virtue. As this awareness deepens, the empath stops trying to convince others of their pain. They see that being understood is not a prerequisite for leaving. They release the need for validation from those who have consistently invalidated them. This is one of the hardest steps, because empaths long to be met emotionally. Letting go of that longing feels like grief, but it is also liberation. The disappearance that follows is not driven by resentment, it is driven by acceptance. Acceptance that some people are not capable of meeting them where they are. Acceptance that potential is not reality. Acceptance that some people are not capable of meeting them where they are. That potential is not reality. Acceptance that staying in a dynamic that erodes self-worth is not noble. This acceptance brings a strange calm. The emotional turbulence settles. The empath becomes less reactive, less invested in outcomes that once consumed them. Others may interpret this calm as indifference. It is not. It is integration. The empath has integrated the lesson that their energy is sacred, that access to their inner world is not a right, but a privilege. They no longer overextend themselves to prove their value. They no longer explain their boundaries in hopes of being respected. They simply act in alignment with their truth. This is often when people are most shocked by the empath's disappearance. There is no fight, no final confrontation, no dramatic goodbye, just a gradual absence, fewer responses, less availability, emotional distance that feels unfamiliar and unsettling. Those who benefited from the empath's presence may feel abandoned, confused, or angry, but what they are really experiencing is the removal of a stabilizing force they never acknowledged. For the empath, this withdrawal is an act of survival. Their nervous system has learned that staying requires too much suppression, too much vigilance, too much pain. Distance allows them to breathe again, to feel their own emotions without managing someone else's reaction, to rediscover parts of themselves that were muted in order to maintain connection. As they step away, the empath begins to reconnect with their intuition. They trust their bodily signals again. They listen when something feels off, instead of overriding it with empathy. They start choosing relationships that feel reciprocal, where care flows in both directions, where vulnerability is met with responsibility rather than entitlement. The disappearance is not an ending, it is a return to self, to authenticity, to emotional safety. The empath no longer needs to prove their worth through endurance. Understand that real connection does not require self-abandonment, and once this understanding takes root, there is no going back to who they were before. They move forward quietly, intentionally, guided by a clarity that does not seek approval, no longer negotiating their presence in spaces that cannot honor it.